Time for us to start our Judges class. I gave us our little overview and introduction a couple weeks ago and then promptly left town, which is always the best way to start a class. But thank you to Scott for covering for that. I hear you got through chapter 1 and that went well. So we are going to move on to chapter 2. And like I mentioned in the introduction that I did, chapters 1 and 2 serve as kind of a double introduction for the book. So chapter 1 shows failure after failure after failure for how the people did not drive out the peoples of the land, how they did not do what they were supposed to do. It's the incomplete harem, as we were talking about. But then chapter 2 is going to show kind of a second part of that and give us a version of the cycle that we're going to see throughout the entire book. So, Judges chapter 2. Like I said, we had the failure after failure in chapter 1. You see Judah was basically okay. They did most of what they were supposed to do, but not all of it. But as chapter 1 progressed, you got to worse and worse fulfillment of the covenant warfare, the holy war that God was calling them to do. And all these peoples are described as still living among the Israelites. And that paints a disturbing picture for us because God's intent, as we learned from the book of Joshua, was to bring a judgment upon all of these peoples and to clear out the land so that Israel can live in it in peace. So a judgment against them and also an opportunity for Israel. That has only happened in part. Some of the people have been driven out. Of course, the cities have been taken. The land is now under Israelite control. So God has kept his promise in that way. But there are still peoples who live among the Israelites. What is God going to do about that? Is he going to do anything about it? And so question number 4 is, what does God do because of Israel's failure? Aaron.
He refuses to drive out all the inhabitants of the land.
Right. He refuses to drive out all the inhabitants of the land. Is God capable of driving out all the inhabitants of the land for Israel?
Yes.
Of course. That doesn't mean that he's going to do it for them. So, the first thing that God did is he reminded them of all he had done for them so far. It's not that God needs Israel to act in order to be powerful. God does not just amplify the efforts of the Israelites. He brought them out of Egypt when they were helpless, hopeless, had nothing that they could rely on. God rescued them. He made a covenant with them. He kept his promise to lead them to the land of Canaan, to conquer this land, and he commanded them to be set apart from the inhabitants of the land and to drive them out. Israel decided that they didn't need to do that. They're happy to have these peoples among them, or if not happy about it, they at least believe that this is the only option. We had some things in chapter 1 like, Judah couldn't go and conquer these people because they had iron chariots. Hopefully you got to talk about that some last week. But what a weird statement, right? As if, oh no, they have iron chariots. There's nothing that we can do against that. God can overcome any of their enemies, and he's shown already that they can have terrible military odds, yet still have an overwhelming victory because God is leading them into battle. So they're not willing to drive out all the people, and God says, okay, then they're going to stay with you. You're going to have to live with these people among you. And what does he say is going to be the result of that for them? Gary.
Well, they were told a long time ago, I want to say from this point even, that they would
Yes.
And as we know, when God gave them over to their enemy, like for 18 years or a number of years because they were evil, that's a thorn in your side.
Yeah. Absolutely. They're going to cause problems for you. I am so thankful that Judges moved away from the terrible expression we had in Joshua. In Joshua, remember, it said thorns in your eyes. That makes me cringe. I don't like that. So here we go back to thorns in your side, which is bad enough, honestly. And the point is the same. That these people are going to be a problem for you. These people are going to make your life difficult. And that's going to be on multiple levels. One, in that their influence is going to harm them spiritually. We're going to see very quickly here, even just within this chapter, that the people start intermarrying, start worshiping the gods of the peoples who are living among them. We'll talk more about that later. But also, these people are going to be scourges for them, going to oppress them and to hurt them in various ways. When Israel fails, these people that they have kept right there among them are going to be the ones to punish them. All of this is avoidable if they would have just driven all the people out of the land. And if they would remain faithful to God, then they don't have to have this thorn in their side. But because they're not doing all that God has said, well, they have to endure greater trouble. So God tells the people this. What's the people's reaction?
They weep.
They weep. Which, that puzzles me. They know enough of the situation to weep. They are sad enough that they have to live with these people among them, yet it's not important enough, and they don't have enough faith to actually go and do what God has said. Because even after this, they don't change anything. They're weeping, but only really because of the consequences, not because it's important to them to do what God has said. And we see that all the time, actually, in our own lives, in the lives of people we know, that we weep over the pain of sin, but we don't actually go and change what we're doing to have a different outcome. And so that's the difference in the kind of sorrow you can have. The Bible talks about a godly sorrow versus a worldly sorrow. The worldly sorrow is desperation, guilt, grief. Godly sorrow is guilt that leads to change, guilt that leads to seeking God. Here, the guilt and the sorrow that they have is not pulling them any closer to God. And this is going to be a theme within the book of Judges, that even though they do call upon God, none of that's going to last for any real length of time. We'll talk more about that as well. Anything else on these first few verses of chapter 2? Yes?
Kind of taken it off on a little bit of tangent, but I thought it was interesting about the angel speaking to all of them, all of the children of Israel, not just like how he spoke just to Moses, just, and for an angel to come from God, you would think that they would be like, wow, I need to listen. This is from directly from God. It's not like to this person, to that person, and
Yeah, it is interesting. The angel just addresses the whole nation like this, the whole, all the people. Doesn't seem to go through a particular prophet or leader. It's a little puzzling here, as you're saying, that the people are impressed by it, but not enough to do anything about it. And that's troubling to me. And that's actually, like I said, one of the themes of the book of Judges. That they have sorrow, they want to rely on God, but not enough to create lasting change. I think the version of this for Christians today is when every time we get into trouble, we're asking God for help, we're coming back to church, we're getting closer to our brethren, but just as soon as our crisis goes away, well then we just go back to normal life. And so God has a piece of our heart, the piece of our heart that needs help in times of trouble, but not the real commitment to serve him every day. And that's somewhat what the Israelites have going on here. They remember God when things are bad, but it doesn't create a lasting commitment. Okay. Anything else? In verses 6 through 10, we see a recap again of the death of Joshua. We saw this at the end of the book of Joshua as well. For that book, it was everything was sandwiched between these two funerals. So we started with the transition of Moses dying and Joshua taking over, and we ended with Joshua dying. And the story of this man, Joshua, leading the people into battle and into conquering the land was kind of kept within the bounds of his life. Well, now here in Judges, we get Joshua's death again because it's important that we talk about the transition that's happening. If you'll remember, at the beginning of the book of Joshua, we talked about how the uncertainty at the beginning was God's made all these promises to the people, and God has led them with this great leader, Moses. Is God still going to keep his promise when there's a new leader? Are they still going to be able to take the land when Moses has died? This wouldn't be the first time that the death of an influential leader killed a movement, right? That's the way things work in the world, that you have that leader die and things can really change. Well, that doesn't cause God to even skip a beat, because God can accomplish what he wants to accomplish through Moses or Joshua or whoever else. Well, now we get to another transition point. Joshua has died. And what we see here is this recognition of the fact that while Joshua was alive, the people were generally faithful to God. Doesn't mean they were perfect. We already saw in the book of Joshua they were not perfect. That their faith was shaky, and there was already kind of the rumblings of problems that they were not driving out all the people, even within the days of Joshua. But generally speaking, they remembered God while Joshua was alive. And that says a lot about Joshua, that he led with enough righteousness and virtue that it was important to the people to follow God while Joshua was leading them. And even after Joshua died, so long as there were people who remembered Joshua, they remembered God. And again, that tells me so much about Joshua. There are people I know who have since died, but who made a lasting impact on me, and who they taught me faith. They taught me how to trust in God. And even though they are gone now, their influence and impact on me did not end. That has carried through even beyond their life. The same kind of thing is true here with Joshua. He has influenced the people in a very good way. And he has kept them faithful to God as much as is within his control. But the pesky thing about time is it just keeps going, that it doesn't stop. And eventually, everyone who knows Joshua dies. Eventually, another generation rises up. And when you pass on to a new generation, now you have new people making decisions, new people who have to establish a faith in God, new people who have their own priorities. So question number 5, what is the message of verses 6 through 10, and what do we learn? Okay.
Well, all that generation was faithful, but they didn't teach the next generation. So when the next generation arose that didn't know God or the work that he'd done, they became idolaters.
Okay. Yeah, this new generation arises, and they don't know God. So they don't know Joshua, and that's bad, but that was going to happen anyway. Even worse, they don't know God. And they're not going to worship him. They're not going to be faithful to him. The condition of Israel from the end of the book of Joshua to Judges 2, as we get to the next generation, has declined precipitously. So things have gotten significantly worse, and that will set the stage for us to move into the rest of the book of Judges. So Kay's alluding to it. Oh, go ahead, Kay. Yeah.
Well, in Deuteronomy, he told them to teach their children and their children's children. But they obviously didn't do this, so it's very important to teach children and children's children and children's children's children if you have a chance.
Mm-hmm.
So teach your children.
Teach your children to love God. Not just make your children do what you want them to do while they're at home. That's not that hard. I mean, it's hard, but it's not that hard. Okay. It's harder to teach them to love God. Mark?
Yeah, they don't have Bibles,
Yeah.
so that's a big issue. It's not written down for them. But, and I haven't done a study on this, so I don't know. But this is over a long period of time where they are every year supposed to be meeting together as a nation to remind them that they are a nation. And they are supposed to have sacrifices and eat it together joyfully before God. That was part of the thing, which should have generated curiosity in the minds of the younger people who were saying, why are we doing this at least? And so, yeah, maybe at home, that whole thing of doing it while you're rising up and going to bed and walking around and wearing it on your forehead kind of fell by the wayside, but they should have at least been doing this, at the very least, this yearly thing.
Yeah. There are multiple layers involved here. You're right. There's these feast days that are supposed to remind them of how God rescued them on the first Passover, right? Rescued them from Egypt, or how God provided for them while they were wandering in the wilderness, and how they had the tabernacle there. All of these different feasts are supposed to prompt the whole nation to be talking about these things. But you have to actually do it. and it has to be important enough to do and to talk about the significance of these things. I don't know if they gave up on the feasts entirely, or if they were doing it just as kind of a holiday, just a basic holiday, without talking about the spiritual significance of these things. But they had forgotten what God had done for them. Mark?
But they were supposed to read the law as well.
Yes. Right. And the law was supposed to be read. There's other layers too. Remember, several times in the book of Joshua, we had where they erected some memorial that was supposed to be in a place where when you passed by it, your kids say, "Dad, what's that?" And you say, "Well, we built this altar here, or our fathers built this altar here to memorialize when we crossed the Jordan, or when we won this battle, or how God took care of us here, or how God kept his promises," all of these different kinds of things. So and a lot of times at those memorials, Joshua or somebody else wrote another copy of the law or inscribed something on these memorials. There's multiple opportunities for them to remember, to ask questions, to talk about these things. It's supposed to happen within the family, as a nation, in all of these opportunities, yet clearly it hasn't happened. Not on any significant level, because when the next generation comes, they don't trust in God. This is something I think is easy for us to forget, because we get so used to making our kids do what we want them to do. It's, so long as you're under my roof, you're going to come to church, or you're going to have your Bible lesson ready, or you're going to do what we do. What happens when they leave? What happens when they get to make choices on their own? You don't get to make their choices for them forever. You have to instill a love of God in them and hope that they latch on to that. And that's a scary thing, because it's never 100% in your control. Everyone gets to make their own decisions. But by far the most terrifying thing to me as a parent, that my kids are going to make their own choices and I won't be able to stop them. But also I know that I have time to show them the love that I have for God. And if that's not real, then it won't stick with them. And so I may not have a perfect way of passing those things on to them, but I do know that if my love for God isn't real, then I don't have any way of passing that on to them. I will have a 0% success rate. So we need to take very seriously our obligation to teach the next generation, to show them what it means to love God and to get them to love God as they should. Because when they go on to live their own lives and are outside of our control, they're going to have to make their own choices. Anything else through verse 10? So verses 11 through 23 give us a couple of things. So one, it shows us how that next generation, when it says another generation rose up and did not worship God, did not trust in God, it's going to show us what they were doing that was so bad. But also this gives us a basic template for the cycle that's going to happen over and over again throughout the book of Judges. So we described this some in the class 2 weeks ago, what that cycle looks like. But here we get it stated explicitly for us, at least in general terms. So what you see here in chapter 2 is kind of a template version. Starting in chapter 3, you'll get the specific versions as this generation sinned in this way, and these particular oppressors came to punish them. So question number 6, first of all, before we really get into all that cycle, but write down all that the text says that Israel did against the Lord. What was God's response? What did this generation do that was so evil?
Followed foreign gods.
They followed other gods.
Those are the people that they had overtaken.
Right. Which is such a preposterous thing, right? Because they have just conquered this land. Those gods were not able to overcome Yahweh in any way. Yet, we're going to worship the gods of the peoples who are among us. They forgot very, very quickly. And actually, that's said multiple times in this section. But they served the Baals. They went after other gods. They worshipped these other these idols. That happens multiple times, even just in this short section. Very offensive thing to God. What else? Gary.
Right along with that, it says they abandoned the Lord. So they went after those gods. But when he uses that phrase, they abandoned the God. Of course, that goes together perfectly, but they didn't even keep the true God in their hearts and minds. They just went completely after the other gods.
Yeah. So for a word like abandon to make sense, as they abandoned the Lord, you have to have some kind of commitment or obligation to that person or to God. There's lots of people that I don't interact with. It doesn't necessarily mean that I've abandoned them. But if I have a commitment to someone, say if I leave my wife and children, that would be abandoning them because I have an obligation to them. I have a duty to them, a commitment to them. So that is where that word abandon really gets force. They have a commitment to God because God made a covenant with them. He said, I will rescue you from Egypt as I have. I will lead you into this land. I will conquer these people for you. I will give you a land that is good. And then you need to obey me. You need to worship me in this way. You need to act in your families and in your communities in this way. You need to serve me in all the ways that I deem fit. And if you don't do that, then I will punish you. Well, they've not done that. They've abandoned God. They've given up on the commitment and the covenant that they have. What else? Dave.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I could just liken this to a child with toys. Anybody who's a parent understands this. You get a child a nice toy that's shiny and fun, and yay, you can't pry it out of their fingers for weeks on end. And then wheels start coming off or something, and it's not so shiny anymore, and they cast it aside. The word used in my version, forsook the Lord, because they cast it aside, whatever, and moved on to the next one. So that kind of sounds to me, it makes me think that's kind of, progress that they make, between that, serving God in one generation and the next generation, they completely forsook them, and they're bowing down to Baal and all this other crazy stuff. So it begs the question, I can't say that those folks didn't teach their children. Maybe they should have tried harder. I don't know. Maybe that's a good example for us because it says that they stopped. They didn't see. God said you didn't see all the wonderful works that I did.
Yeah, the fact that God is
Something about those wonderful works.
right.
You know,
Yeah.
really pounded in kind of thing.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't forsake the shiny new toy. And that's kind of like, I know it's simplistic perspective, but it kind of it's okay.
But yeah, that's what they're doing. They're tossing God to the side. They've gotten their use out of him. They don't find him useful anymore. We've got these other gods that seem so much more interesting. And look at how these people enjoy worshiping their God. And I agree with you, Dave, that I think it's probably not that they didn't teach their children at all in any way about God. Things are rarely that black and white. And the fact that they were generally faithful to God, so long as there were people who remembered Joshua, tells me that it's unlikely that they just completely didn't say anything to their kids about this. The point is, I think what we see happening in the book of Joshua, that although the people are faithful, you've got these signs of wavering. You've got these signs of cowardice and problems that are looming under the surface, that are just kind of beginning to become problems. Those have ripple effects. And the next generation picks up on the lack of conviction. That lack of conviction leads to less forceful and less committed teaching of those children. It leads to more compromises. It leads to a lack of faith, as we already see that they're not conquering all of these people. Their children see that. Their children see their parents saying things like, we can't go conquer these people because they have iron chariots. What does that tell them about God? That God isn't going to help us, that God can't overcome iron chariots, that the people's God is more powerful than our God, that, something, lots of different variations of that, I assume. Whatever it is, they're not getting the full faith and the full commitment in God. Okay?
Well, I guess they knew enough about God to turn back to him when they were oppressed. So there was some knowledge there.
Yeah. There's something. And there's always some judge that rises up that's calling them to come back to God. So yeah, it's not that they've forgotten about the existence of God entirely. And again, that tracks with the way we see a loss of faith today. When people fall away from God, when people are not faithful anymore, is it that they completely forget that he existed? No. And even when it's the next generation you're talking about, it's usually not, well, I wasn't faithful, and so now my kids have literally never heard of God at all. That's not quite how it works. It's, I didn't instill in them the values and the commitment that I should have, and so now they are not faithful. Now they don't trust in God enough to serve him. Mark?
It kind of reminds me today where a lot of people like Christians, and they like Christianity because Christians are nice.
Yeah.
And they actually, as a philosophy, they teach the goodness of Christianity and the good things that it can do, as far as like the Western world and that
Sure.
sort of thing.
Yeah.
And people being brought out of poverty, but they will not say that there is a God. They won't make that leap, but they like the concept, and that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing here, as well as, okay, like you were saying, they relinquish God because they accept this other God. The name Baal itself, its root words mean master or husband. And this is what God's saying. He's saying, look, you don't get to have another husband. It's either me or nobody. And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Gary?
It's interesting that when they really started suffering and they really wanted help, they went and asked, they cried out to God, the one God. Why did they do that? I think it's in Judges I read, and you probably know that there's a point that God says, why don't you ask your gods?
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It says that, I can't go there exactly right now, but I read that word. And that's an excellent question. Why don't you ask them for help?
Yeah.
They cannot help in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. They've been good enough for you all these years, but now you're in trouble, and now they can't help you. Now you need Yahweh. Well, that's not how it works. You've got to be committed to God. David, did you have your hand up?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't implying that you didn't teach the good.
Yeah. No. I know you weren't. Yeah. That's
What I was trying to get to is, sometimes as parents, each generation, we are less, I don't know what the word is, but more forgiving about
Yeah.
things with that, let them get away with more. And
Right.
it's particularly interesting to me that their children went off to serve another God rather than nothing.
Yeah. Right.
They
Yeah.
had to teach them something. So I like to liken things from there to now.
Yeah.
That's what happens in our society today with our children. They go off because they're being taught, throughout the world that, you go serve whatever, whatever you want, go wherever you want, follow whatever you want, it's all okay, well, good, okay. And that's not true. It wasn't true then, and it's not true now. So I think it's a huge flag that we is waving here about, we want our children not to do that. It might be worthwhile to listen to this and put a little more effort into it. That's
Yeah.
all I'm saying. Okay?
Yeah.
Because we can't just ignore it and go, like for instance, give an instance. Oh, well, you can go to the football game on Saturday. You don't have to go to church. You don't have to go to church. You should want to go to church.
Yeah.
And you should teach your child that.
Yeah.
You really should. And why? And everybody knows why. So
Yeah.
the point is that there's millions of things we do as parents that we probably do better, and we should think about it a little bit more. And as Christians, and as examples, that hopefully, it's apparent to me that this happens so many times with Israel.
Yeah.
They follow God, they get the consequences. They repent, God forgives them, and boom, they do it again.
Yeah.
You explain to me why that happens.
Yeah. One of the biggest lessons I ever learned growing up, that has to be learned by any child, by any person who's being taught to love God, is there's something even above my parents. There's someone they have to listen to. There's someone that they submit to. And as simple as that is, that's a lesson that is often not taught. And that has to be shown by what you sacrifice. It has to be shown by what you serve and what you do, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient. That when kids see their parents sacrificing and struggling and making the important commitment to serve God above else, then they will know that God is really above my parents. If God is just something in my parents' life, well, then that's something I can discard. Because there's lots of things in my parents' life. I've taken some of those things and I've discarded others, like every kid does. That's something that we all do. There's some things we like about what our parents did and some things that we don't. Some things that we hold on to and some things we throw away. But if God is just something in our lives, that puts him on that level. If he's something and someone that rules our lives, then that shows it's not optional. That's kind of the point we're making here. Okay?
Well, they had been told not to intermarry because that would cause them to follow idols.
Yeah.
And they intermarried.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's...
that caused them to then follow the idols more than if they had abstained from that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And to that point about the intermarriage, the point there was not mixing the religions, not mixing the service that those people had to their gods with the service they were supposed to have to the one true God. When there was a proselyte who came and joined the people and who served God, they could marry them. The point wasn't don't mix races or don't mix ethnicities or anything like that. The point was you keep yourself separate in that you are serving God. And that's a good principle for life, that it should be a hard thing for us to want to marry someone who doesn't love God, who doesn't serve him. That's what we're supposed to do. How could I want to bind myself to somebody who doesn't share the most important thing with me? There's great caution given to that idea in Scripture. Shows that's not a very wise thing to do. So all of these things that the people have been doing in being unfaithful to God and going after these other idols, that makes God exceedingly angry. So much so that he gave them over to plunderers. They were sold into the hand of their enemies so that they could not withstand them. And that's exactly what God had warned them about. Remember, in the covenant, he said, if you are not faithful to me, I will punish you. And lo and behold, when they are not faithful to him, God punished them. People seem to believe that God isn't going to follow through on that. We want God to follow through on the good promises. He promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. Of course he's going to deliver on that. God has promised us the joy of heaven. Of course he's going to deliver on that. But God's not really going to punish Israel if they disobey. God's not really going to send people to hell. God's not really going to hold to the covenant that he established. Why would you think that? We wish that God would only do the good things and not the punishments. But that's not how he works. He does everything that he has said that he will do. He keeps all his promises, good and bad. So Israel each time tried to fight back. These nations would come and would attack them. Israel was ready for war, and so they'd go out into battle against them. But no matter how much they had prepared, no matter how hard they tried, the hand of the Lord was against them. They would be defeated, and they'd face terrible distress. That's going to happen each time in this cycle. Betty.
Verse 15, that would be a really scary thing. It says they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, and they were greatly distressed.
Yeah.
I think that's terrifying to think that the Lord could, every time you go out, his hands against you, whatever you're going to do, it's not going to work out well.
Yeah.
I mean, terrifying.
Right. That is terrifying.
Turn back right then.
Yeah. And the hand of the Lord is such a common expression used in these books and throughout the Bible. But it always has that idea of weight, pressing down. That's the hand of the Lord. It presses down upon them and crushes them, works against them. You can't overcome that. So question number 7, out of this distress, what did God do for the people? And what was their response? Talking about the general cycle here.
Raised up judges.
Yeah. So when Israel cried out for help, God raised up judges to deliver them.
Unfortunately, it didn't work too good because once the judge was gone, back to the old ways again.
Yeah. That consistently was the case. That no matter how great the salvation, no matter how good or bad the judge, Israel always went back to worshiping those idols. And, you know, it uses really a fairly ugly word to describe this. You may have something different. Verse 17, it says, "Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them." Yours may have, they played the harlot. Either way, but it's ugly. That we saw before that God sold them into the hands of their enemies. Here we also see that Israel's kind of selling themselves into the hands of their enemies. They are choosing to serve these other gods. They are choosing to abandon Yahweh. And so they are bringing this punishment upon themselves over and over. They did not drop any of their practices. They did not drop their stubborn ways. God remains angry with them because they are not learning a lesson out of this. Very troubling. Gary?
Verse 18 says that the Lord was moved to pity for them. I just think that's a great thing to think about and appreciate. The Lord was moved to pity. That's
Yeah.
why we have this cycle. He did help, he helped them, and then they messed up. But it's just a sad comment, really.
Yeah.
And just yesterday, I was studying with a group in Romans, the 10th chapter, the last verse says, "But to Israel, he says, all day long, I have held out my hands to a disobedient and defiant or rebellious people."
Yeah.
And that sentiment is expressed a few times,
Yeah.
I would have gathered you like a hen does her chicks, but you would not.
Yeah.
And it's a sad commentary how much God loves people.
Right. Look at this from God's point of view. This is not what he wants for his people. This is not what he envisioned. This is not what he is aiming for. That he's giving them this land so that they can enjoy it and can grow up strong in it, can have this strong relationship and covenant with him. And Israel is routinely ruining that over and over and over. And they're bringing all this pain upon themselves. And they cry out for help. And God is moved with pity seeing their condition. And he helps them. And then they go right back to it. I'm not suggesting that God didn't know that was going to happen or that he was surprised by it, but that still causes God pain. He is moved to pity, moved to sorrow because of it, but also moved to anger because they are not learning anything out of this. So this shows us quite a bit about God and how he works, that he wants what is best for us, but he is not going to overlook our sin. There's a lot of things. Gary was mentioning some of these verses that have similar ideas. I wanted to gather you up like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Ezekiel has, I saw you struggling in your own blood. That's a very graphic and moving picture for me of God seeing the condition of his people and how desperate and struggling that they were, and he wants to help them, he wants to save them, but continually Israel says, I don't want to be saved. I don't want to be with God. I don't want to worship him. And so they just have to keep enduring all this pain. Next week we will get into chapter 3 a couple concluding thoughts about this, but then launching straight into the first judge, into the first actual iteration of this cycle. So we'll do that next week, Lord willing. Thank you.